Hi everyone, it's Shari Carroll for simonsaysstamp.com, and I've put together a video for you all about gesso. I wanted to discuss how to use it, when to use it, and what it actually is. There are so many out on the market that it's really hard for you, I'm sure, to decide what you need. Several of them are white. There are also clear, black, and colored gessos. You may want to choose a gesso color depending on the project that you're going to create. There are also different thicknesses of gesso, and this first one is a little bit thicker, so I can do some techniques. Like this is the Prima or the Art Basics, and this is a heavy gesso, so I can use this through a stencil or create texture on a page. Gesso is made of an acrylic base, it has water, and it also has chalk in it. And it's a chalk powder, just gypsum, or just kind of like your drywall, and that is what thickens it up. Then there's also an acrylic-based paint that's added to it to create the color. When you have your gesso stored, you are going to want to stir them up because that chalk base is going to settle to the bottom as it sits. So make sure you use a spatula or the back of a paintbrush or use something to stir it up every time. This will keep your gesso fresh and consistent throughout the entire jar. The gesso that I'm showing you now is the Crafter's Workshop White, and I like to use this to prime my canvases because it's a little bit thinner and it's really easy to apply with a brush. Next, I'm showing you the Dina Wakley gesso, and this one is in between the heavy gesso and a thinner gesso. So this one holds its shape, so you could use this through a stencil, and it's also easy to paint onto your surfaces. Next, I want to talk about why we use gesso. I have a canvas here and it's been pre-gessoed, but it's always a good idea to give it a coat of your own gesso just to make sure you have a good coating. To apply it, you'll want to use a stiff brush, and this is the Dina Wakley brush, and go in an up and down motion first. And once you have that covered, then you can go back in a back and forth motion, and this will get the gesso into all the little crevices of the canvas. The one thing to remember about gesso is that it is used as a primer, so it primes the canvas to hold the paint, especially acrylic paints. You may have heard the term tooth. It has tooth, which is a surface in which the paints will stick to. I am going to try out some of the heavier gesso, and I will show you how to apply this with a palette knife. Since it is thicker, it holds the peaks, and you can also lift it up and get really nice kind of a stucco texture to your project. This is really effective when you're using paints over top because the paints will sit in some of the little crevices that you've created just by using that gesso. Another great way of adding texture to your canvas is using a stencil with the heavy gesso, and apply it just like you would an embossing paste or texture paste by using the back side of your palette knife. I have added some pieces to this canvas of different types of surfaces. So I have, at the top I put down some paper and then some cotton lace. I also put down a paper flower, a glass bead, a metal coin, a plastic button, and a piece of wood veneer. These are all different surfaces that I'll want to use some paint on, but what gesso does is it evens the playing field. So I can coat all of these pieces and they will all have the same surface, so my paints or sprays will behave consistently. I also want to show you that you can use water with your gesso to get a little bit of a whitewash look. So I've wet my paintbrush, gotten into that gesso a little bit, and now I can whitewash over the paper. Just by adding a little bit more water or even a baby wipe to go over that, I can whitewash my print to where I can still read the words that are underneath, but it's not so bold. As I'm painting over all of my pieces on the canvas, this reminds me to tell you that you can also use your gesso to cover over pieces that you don't like. If you've done something on your canvas and you're really not happy with it, you can give it a good coating of the gesso to cover it up. So by coloring all of this white, I can use a spray later and start adding paints, and then all my surfaces are completely white. And if you have items that you want to preserve the color, this is a gray flower already, and I want to keep that gray. It has a little bit of a print to it. If I had pattern paper or other types of paper that I might want to preserve the color of that paper, I can use a clear gesso. This will still give me the same surface for the paint to adhere to, but yet it's clear to where I can see through to what it truly was. Next, I want to show you how you can use gesso as a resist. I have a stamped image here and I have sponged on the gesso onto my stamp. You could also sponge through a stencil to get the same effect by using a blending tool or some sort of sponge. You can use any water-based spray or distress ink to get this effect, and I'm just spraying on some Prima Color Bloom, and as I spray I'm starting to get a really nice light image of those circles. I have used a piece of sticky back canvas and I've applied some embossing paste and also some heavy gesso through a stencil with my palette knife, and I want to show you the difference of how the gesso reacts compared to the embossing paste when it's on a surface that's more absorbent like this canvas. So I'll go ahead and press this right down onto my glass surface, and I'll give this a spray with the same Color Bloom, and I have the gesso on the left and the embossing paste on the right. So give this a spray, and at first it looks like it's doing the same thing, but as I wipe my finger over, you can see where the gesso completely resists the color. Also, as I show you up close, you can see where the color has snuck underneath the embossing paste and it has not snuck under that gesso. The gesso seals in that canvas completely. One thing for art journaling when using thin paper is to paint the back side of your pages. This is a really thin dictionary page here, and so I've painted the one side, I've let it dry, and I'll spray on some of that Color Bloom, and I'll show you just really quickly what the difference is between the painted back and the not so painted back. So it looks a little bit similar from this front side. I can see when I take my paper out that it looks a little bit more saturated on the right side than it does on the left, and the writing is really legible on this left side. When I go to turn the page, you can see the difference of how that gesso holds in the color. So when you're using thin page journals, it might be a good idea to coat the back side of your journal with a clear or a white gesso, and that will keep your colors from bleeding through. Next, I have a quick test to show you. I have painted one half of my cardstock with the gesso, and that's just a thin gesso. And I want to show you how some of my markers and coloring will be affected or not affected using a gesso and not gesso. So I have my distress crayon that I'll scribble across both sides, and then with my finger I will blend these colors out. On the gesso side it really blends really smoothly. On the paper side it does blend, but I still see a line of the crayon. I'm finding that when I'm smearing that around on the gesso it does smear quite a bit easier. Next is a gelato. I've just used a really light orange. Again, I'll smear this on the gesso side and onto the regular paper as I move across. And once again, I have a line on that untreated side where that has not smoothed out as much. And finally, I'm using my Faber-Castell Big Pit pen, and these are the Stampers brush pens. I really like to use these a lot. I have just made one line across. I'll go ahead and try to smooth this out on the untreated side, but once I get to that gesso, it's really easy to blend that out. And finally, back to my canvas, my gesso has dried out and I can start spraying this with my color sprays, and all the elements on my page will take that ink evenly while still preserving their detail. I hope I've given you some helpful tips and tricks on when, how, and why to use gesso on your projects. And as always, thanks so much for watching.